Darkness called, but I wasn't home, so he left a message. I tried to call Darkness back, but it went straight to voicemail. I said, "Pick up the phone, Darkness," but he didn't answer. Darkness has been screening his calls. Today, we're going to talk about shadow magic in Pathfinder 2nd Edition on this episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Happy Halloween, travelers and tourists. My name is Mark, and I am the local disaster tour guide. That's right, I am a storyteller who recently learned the new shadow magic spell, Locate Furniture in the Darkness. So follow me real quick. The somatic component involves stepping forward quickly, leading with your big toe, and then the verbal component involves a series of loud, angry yells. Also, I would recommend not casting this spell when you only have one hit point left. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder. Today, in honor of Halloween, we are taking a look at shadow magic options in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. All month long, we're going to be diving in to creepy, spooky, and otherwise terrifying options that Paizo publishes as part of their game. Now, shadow magic, as the name implies, is a brand of magic that is tied to places of darkness. When you step outside of the light, you gain access to interesting and terrifying magic that most mortal spellcasters are not brave enough or maybe foolish enough to try and master. So today, I want to take a look at some of the different ways that Paizo presents shadow magic in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and talk about some of the options that your character can use if they're interested in this brand of magic. Now, I will say before we get going, my original plan was for the video today to be on the Thaumaturge class from Dark Archive. Unfortunately, my family has been really sick for the last week and a half, and that just really messed up my recording schedule. But hopefully by the time this video goes live, I will have had a chance to at least sit down and record the Thaumaturge, so hopefully that video will be coming soon. I want to go ahead and give you some page references for different content that you can check out. The majority of the content today is going to come from the Shadow Magic section of the Book of Unlimited Magic in Secrets of Magic, and specifically we're going to be looking at content that can be found from pages 224 to 229 of the book Secrets of Magic. We're also going to take a quick look at some of the content that's available in the Advanced Player's Guide. We're going to be looking at some content on page 138 for the Sorcerer class, and we're going to be looking at the Shadow Dancer archetype, which can be found on pages 192 and 193 of the APG as well. Also, I think it's worth noting that Pathfinder just has a lot of fun shadow-themed spells kind of scattered throughout its work. Like, one of the spells we're going to talk about today is called Shadow Blast. It's found on page 367 of the core rulebook, and it's a really fun and flexible spell that's straight up in the core rules. So be aware that we're probably not going to hit every shadow magic option, but if you're willing to read and explore a little bit, you can probably find a lot of different fun and interesting tidbits that Paizo gives us. But as always, the darkness of being a YouTube content creator has to creep in a little bit, and it's time for the YouTube stuff. Please remember, if you enjoy this content, like, share, subscribe. You can check out my free Discord and my Patreon. Both of those are linked in the video description. All of that stuff helps to support this channel and keep the content coming. And as always, the most important thing you can do is jump into the comments section, leave your thoughts, your suggestions, and your ideas, because truly the best part of this job is getting to hear from you. Alright, let's get started. Now, the first question that you want to ask if you are building a shadow magic style character is what the story of your character is going to be. Shadow magic obviously draws on a lot of secretive and dark themes, but Paizo does go out of their way to emphasize that while there are many evil examples of shadow magic, such as the clergy of Zon-Kuthon, there are also examples of heroic uses of shadow magic inside of the Golarion setting as well, so it is perfectly feasible to play a good aligned character who makes use of shadow magic. In Secrets of Magic, they do give us a few details to help you kind of explore the idea of shadow magic. One of the first things that they say is that shadow magic is available to any of the 4 traditions of magic inside of Pathfinder 2e. Arcane, Divine, Occult, and Primal casters all have the ability to access and use shadow magic, though they do note that between the 4 traditions there is a different level of appeal, and certain traditions are more likely to be drawn to shadow magic than other. On one extreme, you have the Occult tradition, and pretty much every shadow spell in Pathfinder 2e, I haven't found an exception yet, there's probably one out there somewhere, but pretty much every shadow spell in Pathfinder 2e is already available to the Occult tradition anyways. Like, Occult magic really just kind of draws on the themes of shadow magic very naturally, and it lines up pretty well. On the opposite extreme, you have the Primal magic tradition, which, at least at the base level, has very few shadow magic options. Overall, Secrets of Magic does note that the Occult and Divine magical traditions are the most likely to get involved in shadow magic because of the spirit essence associated with those 2 traditions. The spirit essence aligns very closely with shadow magic, and that causes those 2 traditions to be the most inclined towards using shadow magic. Now, arcane magic is a little bit of an interesting case study. Arcane casters do have access to a lot of shadow magic spells, and most shadow magic that Pathfinder has published is available in the arcane tradition, but a lot of these shadow magic focused options have this sacrifice element to it, meaning that if you really want to push shadow magic, you kind of have to give something else up. And the arcane tradition kind of struggles with this push and pull because one of the big advantages of arcane magic is it has the largest spell list in the game. So focusing in shadow magic for an arcane caster kind of cuts into one of their advantages, but it is still something they are capable of doing if they are interested in that particular style of magic. And as previously noted, the Primal tradition really doesn't have much shadow magic at all, but there are ways for Primal casters to access shadow magic, and I'm going to be honest, there's some cool build options here. If you want to make like this creepy druid haunting civilization from the shadows, you've got some options here. But those are just mechanical considerations. What about the question of the where and why your character has actually devoted themselves to the idea of shadow magic? Secrets of Magic goes a little bit farther and gives us 7 different options that might serve as a basis for a character who is interested in using shadow magic. They give us kind of 6 specific locations that you can build off of, and then give you a 7th more general option that could apply to other places inside of the Golarion setting. Now, some of these options are really, really obvious. For example, Nadal and Ustalov. You expect them on the list, and they're definitely there. Ustalov is your gothic horror setting in Golarion, so you know that there is going to be a lot of ties to shadow magic in that kind of setting. And they talk about a couple of different regions where if you really want to dive into the idea of shadow magic, you can tie it to that region of Golarion pretty easily. Another easy one is Nadal, which is a country controlled by the Church of Zon-Kuthon, who is the only core deity with the Darkness Domain. Darkness Domain, shadow magic, you can see the connection there. Now, with Nadal especially, the ties to shadow magic in that location definitely have that evil and creepy twist to them that you expect with something called shadow magic. And Ustalov, with its emphasis on Gothic-style horror, is going to have some of those darker connotations and story elements as well. So if you're looking for a way to play with dark magic story themes, then those are definitely two easy settings you can use, but Paizo does give us a couple of other options if you're looking for something that is not necessarily leaning heavily in the evil direction. The other four locations that Paizo gives us are Cheliax, Geb, Sarkoris, and the Mwange Expanse. Now Cheliax and Geb are both locations where there are certainly plenty of evil elements in that setting. Cheliax is controlled by infernal politics and Geb is ruled by the undead. But in both of those occasions, Zon-Kuthon is not heavily associated with those regions, meaning that for Cheliax and Geb, shadow magic is often a way for people living in those societies to protect themselves or hide themselves from the oppressive elements that they live under. Sarkoris is similar in a lot of regards. Sarkoris was once home to the World Wound from Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, and Secrets of Magic notes that there are many shadow magic casters who live in and around Sarkoris who were using shadow magic as a way of avoiding the demon invasion that was tormenting that realm for so long. Finally, in the Mwange Expanse, you have a region that doesn't have a lot of ties to specific dark themes like the other regions that we've discussed. And here, shadow magic can almost be looked at as a tool for hunting or otherwise giving yourself an advantage in a very, well, to be honest, primal environment. Remember I said earlier that there are some story beats that allow druids and other primal casters to make use of shadow magic. This is an example of that. Now, those specific 6 locations are listed in Secrets of Magic, but there is a 7th option that is used that is kind of a generic option that you could apply anywhere to Golarion, which is to give your character a tie to the shadow plane in one fashion or another. If your character or their heritage in some way is closely linked to the shadow plane, they might be drawn to shadow magic even if the region of the world they occupy is not necessarily known for that style of magic. They might still access it. So don't feel like you have to go with just the 6 suggestions listed before. Your character can come from anywhere, and if they're connected to the shadow plane, they can still make use of the magic pretty easily. Now, I did note earlier that with Nadal and the Church of Zon-Kuthon, Zon-Kuthon is the only core deity that comes with the darkness domain, so that is the deity with the most explicit tie to shadow magic, but there are some other options if lawful evil deities isn't your particular cup of tea. 2 good examples that might be worth checking out are Grandmother Spider and Nocticula. Nocticula has the darkness domain as one of her explicit options, and Grandmother Spider has the darkness domain as an alternate domain. So if you're interested in approaching shadow magic from a divine perspective, those are 2 good options you can look into, and Archives of Nethys will list other deities that might have the darkness domain as well, so there are definitely options to explore. Okay, but that's all story stuff. Let's talk mechanics. What are some of the mechanical options you can use if you are interested in shadow magic as a concept for your character? Well, the first and easiest option is the Shadow Bloodline for the Sorcerer, which is found on page 138 of the Advanced Player's Guide. This is an occult tradition variant of the Sorcerer, and it follows the normal Bloodline format that Sorcerers use, but it is just explicitly your magic is tied to the plane of shadow, and you get a lot of shadow-themed powers. The occult tradition borrows heavily from shadow themes. So the Shadow Bloodline Sorcerer, that is an easy and early go-to. You can definitely check that one out. But moving past that, I'd like to talk about some options that are available to a wider range of characters and might be interesting to a number of different players. Let's start with Shadow Companions and Shadow Familiars. So both of these options will come from Secrets of Magic, and we'll talk about Shadow Companions first. This essentially allows you to have an animal companion that is tied in one way or another to shadow magic. Now, Shadow Companions and Shadow Familiars are uncommon options, which means you need Game Master permission to access these. But Shadow Animal Companions are going to present two different options that players might use. The first is the Shadow Hound Animal Companion. Any character that can take an Animal Companion might be able to recruit a Shadow Hound, which is, well, a hound tied to the plane of shadow. I know, big surprise, right? But essentially this is a baseline Animal Companion that will progress using the normal rules for Animal Companions found in the core rulebook. In particular, the Shadow Hound is an interesting option because it comes with an advanced maneuver called Bay, which is a 20-foot emanation demoralize, essentially allowing your companion to attempt to intimidate a number of different creatures around it all at once. But what if Shadow Hound is not your particular cup of tea? Are there any other ways you might be able to modify an Animal Companion to give them some shadow magic? And the answer is yes. There is an Animal Companion specialization called the Shade specialization. Now, I have an entire video on Animal Companions, and I'll throw a link up here in case you want to go check that out, because a full discussion of the rules for Animal Companions is beyond the scope of this video. But in that video, I divide Animal Companions into different tiers, and the specialization tier is what I refer to as Tier 3 in terms of the types of Animal Companions you can have. So, if you get an Animal Companion up to its Tier 3 choice, in place of a normal choice like Tracker, you can instead take the Shade specialization, which is an interesting defense-oriented specialization for your Animal Companion. In particular, it's going to give your Animal Companion some damage resistance and the ability to use the step action to a range of 10 feet rather than 5 feet if the Animal Companion is standing in dim light or darkness, and the Shade specialization can effectively be applied to any Animal Companion that gets up to that Tier 3 level choice. And of course, the next uncommon option is the Shadow Familiar, and the Shadow Familiar is a type of specific familiar, and the rules for specific familiars can be found on page 147 of the Advanced Player's Guide. And let's go ahead and be honest, much like Animal Companions, Familiars is almost its own conversation, so I'll throw a link to my Familiar video up here as well, so you can go check that out if you're interested in more details on how Familiars work. Essentially, a specific familiar is a familiar that requires you to spend a certain number of familiar ability picks on very specific choices. But if you take those exact choices and meet the requirements of the specific familiar, you then get other bonus benefits that come with that specific familiar in question. In this case, a Shadow Familiar is where a spellcaster, rather than bonding with a typical familiar, has separated their shadow from their body and animated their shadow to serve as a familiar instead. Now, there's a lot of fun directions you can take the Shadow Familiar concept, but my personal favorite part of the Shadow Familiar is that Shadow Familiars get an ability called Steal Shadow, which allows them to steal a shadow from another creature and inflict the enfeebled condition on it, making your Shadow Familiar kind of this debuff option that you can use against your enemies. So if you're playing a character that has a familiar, Shadow Familiar might be an option worth checking out. However, I will say this, Shadow Familiar is one of the most demanding specific familiars in the game. It comes with 7 required ability picks, which means that if you want a Shadow Familiar, you're probably going to be using it either with a witch, or an improved familiar style wizard, or a character that has the familiar master archetype. Those are probably going to be the only choices that get enough ability picks to qualify for this choice. So it's a little bit niche, but it's a lot of fun if you can get it. But far and away, the broadest options, if you really want to dive into shadow magic, are 2 different archetypes in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, the Shadow Dancer from the Advanced Player's Guide, and the Shadow Caster from Secrets of Magic. Now, the Shadow Dancer can be found on pages 192 to 193 of the APG, and it's one of the earliest archetypes that was added to Pathfinder 2nd Edition. This is a mid to high tier archetype. Taking this archetype requires you to be a master in stealth and an expert in performance, but the archetype gives you access to a lot of fun rogue abilities and a lot of fun, unique shadow magic focus spells. It is an archetype that seems to be geared towards martial or skill-based characters who want to add a flair of shadow magic to what they can do. For more magically oriented characters, you have the Shadowcaster from Secrets of Magic, and though this archetype was added to the game later, this archetype is actually easier to access. All you have to be able to do is cast spells. Doesn't matter how strong the spells are, if you can cast spells, then you can pick up this archetype. So Shadowcaster is actually going to be available starting at level 2 for a lot of characters. Now I should note that, as the name implies, Shadowcaster is very much spellcaster oriented. The Shadow Dancer gives a lot more options for martial or skill-based characters, but if you go with Shadowcaster, this is going to be an archetype that definitely cares more about the magic side of the equation. One of the things I really like about the Shadowcaster is it comes with a unique story requirement. To become a Shadowcaster, you have to give up that piece of your soul that allows you to resist the call of darkness. And once you become a Shadowcaster, you are forever barred from using any kind of spell that has the light trait. You have embraced the darkness, it is your home now, and you will never call upon the magic of light again. From a storytelling perspective, I think that's awesome. Now, with all of that being said, you might think that the Shadow Dancer and the Shadowcaster are going to come with very different options from one another, but I kind of hate to say this, honestly you need to talk about these two archetypes together because they pull from a lot of the same mechanics. Most of the stuff that the Shadow Dancer can do that the Shadowcaster can't do is going to be in terms of the rogue options that the Shadow Dancer archetype offers. The Shadow Dancer has the ability to pick up sneak attack and can access different rogue feats like Spring from the Shadows. But in terms of the actual magic that a Shadow Dancer can use, the Shadowcaster can actually access those feats and spells as well in almost every case. Now, since the dedication for the Shadow Dancer archetype is a little more intensive, it is going to come with greater dark vision and a nice +2 bonus on stealth, but the actual shadow magic spells of Dance of Darkness, Shadow Jump, and Shadow Illusion, all three of those examples of shadow magic are going to be available to a Shadowcaster. The Shadowcaster, meanwhile, is going to add its own shadow focus spells known as Inscrutable Mask and Dark Light that they can gain access to, and one of the things I'm going to say here is, honestly, Dark Light and Inscrutable Mask especially strike me as abilities that I would probably allow a Shadow Dancer to take if they were interested. Now, it's not rules as written, but if it's something you're interested in and you're playing a Shadow Dancer, you might talk to your Game Master and see if some of the Shadowcaster options can transfer over. I think it's only fair that the options kind of go both ways, especially since Shadow Dancer is a more demanding archetype to gain access to. However, outside of the realm of shadow focus spells, the Shadowcaster is going to have access to some fun special abilities. One is an archetype feat called Shadow Spells, which just adds a lot of shadow spells to your spell list. Now, if you're playing an Occult caster, ignore this archetype feat, it is not for you. Arcane casters also probably are not going to benefit a lot, but Divine and especially Primal casters who are interested in the Shadowcaster archetype, this is going to be an important feat because it's going to add a lot of shadow spells to your spell list, and that is going to be something I think you'd be very interested in. However, the real core of the Shadowcaster is an archetype feat called Shadow Reservoir and an upgrade archetype feat called Secrets of Shadow that is going to give your character more spells. That's literally what the Shadow Reservoir does, is it just gives you some spell slots that are part of your Shadow Reservoir, and these spell slots are outside of the normal spells that you use or prepare. Now, the Shadow Reservoir does come with some downsides, and I would go and read very carefully on exactly how the Shadow Reservoir works, but just the ability to expand your spell list and give your character extra spellcasting options, that is very powerful. There's not a lot of stuff like this in Pathfinder 2e, and it really makes the Shadowcaster a standout archetype inside of the game. But regardless of if you want to use Shadow Dancer or Shadowcaster, both of these archetypes are going to offer a way to create a character that has a strong tie to shadow magic. Now, both of these archetypes, I would like to say, will give you access to a spell called Shadow Blast, and if you do not already have Shadow Blast on your spell list, this is a very, very interesting spell, and it's actually from the core rulebook, page 367. This is a spell that I had overlooked until I was researching this video, and I'm probably giving it its own Spellslingers Academy sometime in the near future. But Shadow Blast is one of those spells, if you don't have access to it from your base character, this is one of those really fun things you can pick up through these archetypes, and I strongly recommend checking it out. Essentially, Shadow Blast is this very flexible spell where you can choose the area and damage, but then your enemy gets to turn around and pick a more advantageous saving throw to determine how they react to the spell. It's an interesting trade-off that I haven't seen in a lot of spells before, and I'm probably going to be dropping this in my game very soon. So I know that's a little bit of a tangent, but if you're playing a Shadow Dancer or a Shadowcaster and you don't have Shadow Blast to start out, definitely take a look at that spell because I think it's something you will find very interesting. But that's all I've got for you today, so let me turn the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts about shadow magic in Pathfinder 2e? What is your favorite shadow magic option that I've discussed today, and are there shadow magic options inside of the game that I have overlooked? Jump down into the comments section and let me know what your thoughts are. As always, don't forget the YouTube stuff. Like, share, subscribe, check out the free Discord, the Patreon, the links are in the video description. But as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day. Hello? Oh, Darkness! Hey, how's it going? What? Oh, yeah, I'm free for lunch later. What do you say to Dairy Queen? Pumpkin pie blizzards on me.